today. With us now for a look at where things stand, the Assistant Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I want to just pick up on the paid parental leave debate that featured in question time again today, and in particular ask you as a new dad, what did you do in terms of your own arrangements for paid parental leave?
Well, like my wife, like many women, accessed both schemes. But as I've also said, there is a need to end this entitlement. We think it's fairer for the taxpayer if the employer has a scheme which is more generous than the 18-week government scheme, that provides for the PPL for the employee. But if that employer scheme either does not exist or is below the government's 18-week minimum wage, that the government then steps in. But
so hang on, I just want to clear this up.
We have to find savings.
Your wife and you were double dipping?
Well, we accessed both schemes as my wife was entitled to, and there are many people, I'm sure on both sides of the House, who have done that.
And yet the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, said today that this is quite surprising, and frankly, Labor and the unions have got a lot of explaining to do.
Well, as you know, we've been focusing on the fact that people in the public service have been accessing, David, two PPL schemes, both paid for by the government.
But why is the Treasurer surprised about it when his Assistant Treasurer has actually been doing it?
Well, I think that you'll find that a lot of people who have working wives, or dare I say it, working husbands, have an employer scheme and also have been able to access the government scheme.
And you didn't feel it was doing anything wrong?
Absolutely not. And as I've said, this is a system which has enabled people to be entitled to these two payments. But going forward, we think it's much fairer to the taxpayer that we allow only one of the more generous schemes, whether it's the employer or the government. You see, we have reprioritised funding because we've not proceeded with the more generous paid parental leave scheme that we initially were prepared to do, and we took to the last two elections. And we've put that money into childcare so much that nearly 250,000 families will either spend more time in the workforce or enter the workforce for the first time.
Okay,
so
and all of that's fair enough. But when you've sat there in Parliament today and yesterday and heard some of your colleagues saying this is essentially a union stitch-up, Labor's done this to help their union mates and their union masters, you didn't tap anyone on the shoulder and say, well, hang on, some of us have done it as well.
But look, the point we're making here is this is an entitlement that exists under the current law, but it's fairer for going forward that we, save the $1 billion, which is what we've announced we would save, that we would allow people just to access one scheme. And, David, to be honest, I'm hopeful of having more kids in the future because we only have one.
Well, I hope you do too, but you won't get the $11.5 grand from the taxpayer.
And you know what? And I think that's a fairer deal for the taxpayer, and that's why I've supported the change, like all my colleagues on our side of the House do.
All right, and are you comfortable with the way it's been approached by the government? Some of the language used, no issues there, given you are one of the ones they're talking about?
Well, can I just say, David, that the opposition have tried to verbal Joe Hockey and Scott Morrison in this case, because none of them have commented on the existing scheme as it's been portrayed by the Labor Party.
So double dipping, for example?
Deal with this issue. Well, double dipping just refers to the fact that you can get two schemes, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. All right. I've said it myself.
All right, well, okay, as a double dipper, you're allowed, I suppose, to use that word. Let's move on now. We also saw you in question time this afternoon referring to Shorten's shortcut as you put the pressure on him ahead of tonight's budget reply. Now, we have seen Bill Shorten propose 2 new tax increases. What about the government's record? We know in the budget papers tax collections as a proportion of GDP are going to go up and up over the coming years. Is the government doing enough to lower taxes?
Well, we've abolished the carbon tax, we've abolished the mining tax, we've just announced a major cut for small business, in fact the lowest company tax rate for small business in nearly 50 years, quite an astonishing move, and one that's been really warmly received by the small business sector. Clearly, more tax revenue is coming in from bracket creep, and this is something we would like to deal with, but the budget's not in a position to provide those sort of tax cuts to deal with bracket creep.
You've also announced in this budget, though, nearly $4 billion in increased taxes for fly and fly-out workers, backpackers, charity workers, and the GST applying now to online digital products. So there are tax increases here as well in this budget.
Well, look, there are revenue measures, and we can deal with them individually, but but you see, the one you referred to with the GST, that's not an increase in tax. That's just
extending the tax.
GST. It's just applying the GST in a consistent manner, both to the domestic
I'm not quibbling with any of them, but I'm just making the point that you are extending or increasing taxes to the tune of nearly $4 billion.
But I would disagree with that. I'm saying we're not increasing taxes. What I'm saying is we have some revenue measures there, including changes to FBT concessions and the like, and to ensure the consistency and the integrity of our system. I mean, take, for example, what we're doing with multinational companies and strengthening the anti-avoidance rule. That's likely to produce some revenue coming out of that, but that's not an increased tax.
How much revenue?
That's just about ensuring well, that's still to be found out as we go ahead with the ATO's investigations into these contrived or artificial tax arrangements by the so-called big 30 multinationals with revenue over $1 billion.
Now, what about on superannuation? Can you clear up for us exactly what the government's position is? Is it no change just for this term or beyond this term?
Well, we have no plans to increase taxes on super, unlike the Labor Party, which has already announced 2 recent increases in tax on super, particularly on people with earnings more than $75,000, which could hit pensioners and will certainly hit more than the 60,000 people they claim to affect. You see, the Labor Party has a terrible track record on superannuation. We all remember Kevin Rudd coming into the 2007 election saying he wouldn't change tax on superannuation one jot, one tittle. And in fact, they introduced 12 adverse changes and $9 billion worth of additional taxes on super. Unlike the Labor Party, we said going to the last election we wouldn't make any adverse or unexpected changes to superannuation during this term, and we're going to stick to that.
OK, but are you still going to go ahead with a review into superannuation, or is that now cancelled?
Well, we have a tax white paper, and superannuation concessions were discussed in the context of the tax white paper, but we certainly have no plans to increase tax on super, and actually this is one of the clear points of distinction between us and the Labor Party. They are whacking taxes on super. They've got additional taxes that they want to put on multinationals, which we're told by the Business Council of Australia and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry will send jobs offshore. On our side, we're looking for savings. Labor hasn't come up, dare I say it, with any savings. And can I just say, David, Labor is in complete denial about the fiscal wreckage that they left us. They left an enormous amount of debt and deficit, and yesterday Bill Shorten on radio was asked 13 separate times to accept responsibility for Labor's debt and deficit fiasco. They didn't, and now there's a $52 billion black hole with savings that they're blocking and increased spending commitments.
Assistant Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Nice to be with you. Thanks, Dave.
We'll take a break. Back with more on PM Agenda. Stay with us.